and passions for community service, friendship, and giving back. Rotary is organized into clubs where members work on a diverse range of service projects. Regionally, Rotary clubs support food banks, community building, education and scholarships, health, youth, and environmental sustainability. Globally, Rotary has prioritized support for the environmental sustainability. An example is in 2017 to 2018, our Rotary International president led Rotarians worldwide in planting over 1.2 million trees. Locally, Rotarians have been dedicated to climate and the environment, including a regional cleanup of the inner urban trail, support for agriculture, clean water, salmon habitat restoration, seed banks, and so much more. And yet we viewed environmental sustainability as such a gigantic area of opportunity for both involvement and impact that we wanted to establish a Rotary Club devoted exclusively to this cause. Our goal for this focused cause-based club is to attract other climate-caring members who will dedicate their skills, knowledge, network, and connections, resources, all in the advance and advocacy of climate causes in this region. With its focus on our environment, this new Rotary Club is positioned to be impactful by organizing programs and implementing projects and attracting participants with a shared commitment. This new Rotary Club will define its own priorities, establish its own norms to fit the needs of its members. Similar cause-based Rotary clubs in other parts of the world have promoted education by inviting expert speakers like we have today, or sponsoring school-based programs, or taking field trips, or joining together in hands-on service projects. The choices are many. Why be part of the new Environmental Rotary Club of Puget Sound? We'd like you to join other environmental enthusiasts in our region to engage in the essential work of preserving our natural world through club activities, volunteer projects, even social events that can be impactful while offering networking opportunities that build professional and personal connections. And Rotary is all about connections and connecting, and this new cause-based club affords both. I'd like to connect you now with two of the charter members of the Environmental Rotary Club of Puget Sound. And the first one I'm going to be introducing is Kimberly Peterson. Kimberly?
Hello, hello. Thank you all for coming. My name is Kimberly Peterson, and I am proud to be a charter member of the Environmental Rotary Club of Puget Sound. I worked for several years as a journalist covering energy and electricity policy. I then went to law school because I wanted to help make the energy transition to low carbon energy sources smoother and better. The thing is, you can't talk about the energy industry without also talking about the environment. I have been a Rotary adjacent person for most of my life because my mom is very active in Rotary. The community service aspect of Rotary has long appealed to me. This is why I am so excited to be a founding member of this new Environmental Rotary Club. I hope you enjoy the speaker today. I will work hard to help organize more events, speakers, and community service activities to help the environment and educate others about environmental issues. Thank you again for coming. And I would now like to introduce you to our charter member number one, Janice Hoggett.
Hi, my name is Janice Hoggett. I am excited to be a part of this new club and a part of Rotary. Rotary has been in my life all my life. My father was a Rotarian and very active and introduced our family to Rotary events. And through that, I learned about service above self. I learned about the different aspects of Rotary that are promoting peace, fighting disease, clean water, saving mothers and children, supporting education, and helping local economies around the world with Rotary clubs all over the world that we partner with to do various different projects. This newest project that they've added the focus of environmental sustainability and climate change is near and dear to my heart. I've worked with the local Puget Sound Keepers and other programs through my work with Aveda to help provide clean water and to participate in this new Rotary Club endeavor to provide an impact in our local Puget Sound area and possibly around the world to help the environment is a very exciting opportunity, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. And with that, I'll give you back to Kathy.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Janice. Now I'd like to turn the program over to a fellow Rotarian, John Booker. John?
Thank you. I am a member of the I am a member of the Fremont Rotary Club, and I'm a professor emeritus in the Department of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington. It is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dave Montgomery. He is a member of what we call the Surface Processes Group. Surface processes involve the interactions of the atmosphere with the solid Earth or other planets, and his primary interest is geomorphology and fluvial studies, more simply described as how rivers behave and their interaction with topography and biology. The UW has become a world leader in surface processes over the last 20 years, and Dave has been awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, commonly known as the Genius Award. He believes in communicating science to the general public and has published books ranging from the history of salmon to the development of geology in the context of the story of Noah's flood and the collapse of civilizations due to erosion. Today, he will be discussing material from two of his most recent books, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, and The Hidden Half of Life, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health. Both are available at a discount at Third Place Books. I encourage you to go get them for yourself if you want to all the details. And with that, take it away, Dave.
Okay, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here and talking to this inaugural group of Puget Sound environmental Rotarians. And hopefully you will be seeing my slides now, yes?
I guess
yes,
so.
all right, I got thumbs up. Okay, well, great. Oh, I'm very happy to be speaking to you all for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, I've given a lot of talks to different Rotary clubs around the state and really around the country over the years. And I've been impressed by the dedication to public service that's at the heart of the club. And I've also worked for years studying the natural environment, and my own inclinations lie towards environmental sustainability in my professional work and in my sort of personal advocacy. And this is a nice opportunity to sort of put those two together. So I'm really thrilled that you're starting this club and wish you all the well in sending it off. And what I'm going to tell you about today is give you a bit of an overview on a trilogy of books. So, well, sort of, John, I'll one-up you and we'll do 3 books today. And trying to do 3 books in 45 minutes might be kind of a crazy endeavor, but I'm going to try and give you a flavor for these because there's actually a thread that runs through them. I'm the kind of geologist who studies what shapes the surface features of the Earth. So, how erosion carves the Cascades, what that big scoop out of the north side of Mount Rainier is, all that kind of stuff. And in my professional life, I had the opportunity to work all around the world studying erosional processes under natural systems. And that started me thinking about how the relationship of human societies to erosional processes actually has played out over the last 10,000 years in the post-glacial agricultural world. And these 3 books reflect my sort of what you might consider off the books intellectual exploration of the, and forgive the pun please, but the intellectual exploration of those ideas, with the dirt book being the one you might expect a geologist to write, looking back at the way that how people treated the land affected the longevity of societies around the world. And it's a bit of a depressing book in a sense, in the sense that the story of how people have treated land for the last 10,000 years is not all that uplifting. There's a few exceptions that I go into in the book, but there's real lessons from that book about the state of the world today. The Hidden Half of Nature, the middle book in this trilogy, was written with my wife, Ann Baclay, who's a biologist. And when you think about what makes for healthy, fertile soil, it's the marriage of geology and biology, the mineral matter and the biota. So there's kind of a sense to why we would write this together. And then it goes into the science of microbial ecology that really underpins our new understanding of what makes for healthy, fertile soil, but also what makes for a healthy gut. And there turns out to be great parallels between what goes on around plant roots and what goes on inside each and every one of us. And the third book, Growing a Revolution, takes the lessons of dirt and takes the science in the hidden half of nature and looks at the question of, can we actually restore the fertility to the world's agricultural lands and do so in a more environmentally friendly way than we've been doing? And that is essentially where I'm going to take you on the next 40 minutes or so. But the executive summary overview is that we've turned a lot of land that was once verdant at the end of the last glacial epoch into land that is desertified or degraded. We've basically been mining soil for the history of throughout the history of agriculture, and we have turned an awful lot of fairly good land into fairly degraded land. What does that look like at a global scale? Well, this is sort of the best sort of coarse scale map I can find of that. It's a UN's global map of soil degradation. The areas of the world where the human activity has either degraded the soil to some degree, and that's a kind of a loose definition. There's a lot of that yellow color or that orangey color up there, but also very degraded soil, places where the soil has been degraded enough to actually affect its ability to grow food, to impact agronomic productivity. And by the estimates I've been able to triangulate out of the literature, we've degraded something like a quarter to maybe upwards of a third of the world's potentially farmable land to the point where it's been taken out of agricultural production since the dawn of agriculture. And areas that are sort of poster child, examples of that would be places like Libya today or Syria, where we know that we have Roman tax records of high wheat harvests from land that literally does not even have soil left on it anymore. But I also like to use this map to start out because you can go within any one of those red zones on this map and you can find farms that are building healthy, fertile soil, that are turning around the implication you would take home from this broad brushed map demonstrating global soil degradation. You can find places all over the world that are doing the exact opposite, and that's where we're going to end up. So forgive me if the start of this talk is a little depressing as we go into the causes of declines of civilizations and erosion and degradation of soil, but I promise I will end on an optimistic note because I've actually become an optimist that we can solve the kind of problem that I was writing about in Dirt. So bear with me, we'll get there, we'll get to the optimistic part, but if we look back at the second half of the 20th century, in the time between the Second World War and the year 2000, soil erosion and degradation caused farmers to abandon some 430 million hectares of arable land. That's an area about equivalent to 1/3 of all the world's present cropland, and it's the size of China and India combined. Now, it's distributed all over the world. It's not all in one place, right? But it adds up to a large amount of land that is no longer in production to feed people at a time when our own population is projected to grow by another third over the course of the rest of this century. And the problem of land degradation is not just ancient history. If you look at the problem of ongoing soil erosion and degradation today, the UN put out a report in 2015, their Global State of the Soil Assessment, that concluded that humanity, the global us, we're losing about 0.3% of our global food production capacity each and every year to ongoing soil loss and soil degradation. Now, 0.3% is not a very big number, is it? That's probably about, what we're all getting on our savings accounts these days. But if you play it out over the next century, if you think like a geologist, that 100 years is really not, it's just a down payment on the future. It's a short period of time in the whole course of human history. That 0.3% is going to translate into another 30% over the time when our population is expected to rise by about as much. It's my contention that global agriculture needs to change this century if we're going to have a chance of feeding the world of the 22nd century. And I think that these books provide some insight into how we might be able to do that and actually pull off that kind of a transformation. But I'm going to start with the backward look that I talked about in the Dirt book. It's the one that really started me on the road of thinking about problems of land degradation, soil degradation, and eventually led me to thinking about potential solutions. But if you look back through history, And I did a lot of research on the sort of archaeology and what's known as geoarchaeology, the sort of the geology that's been done along with archaeological studies. And you can find the solid evidence that soil degradation played a role in the demise of ancient civilizations, going back to Bronze Age Europe, Rome, the southern United States, classical Greece, Central America, and more societies around the world that I documented in that book. But the explanation you generally tend to find in environmental history books is that deforestation led to soil erosion, which undermined civilizations. And I realized in working around the world and having studied erosion in the Northwest, where we have an active timber industry, which has not led to the wholesale loss of soil off the Cascades, that there was actually a different villain. And I'm not saying that timber harvesting doesn't cause landslides. It clearly does. I've gotten into a lot of trouble for documenting that in the Northwest, but it doesn't affect broad regions of the hillsides. It tends to affect rivers and streams more because you're kicking off landslides at particular places and they all route down through the river network to the places where salmon live. But that was a different book. That's the first popular book I started off writing, King of Fish. But anyway, in writing Dirt, I realized that there was a different villain in the history of land degradation that relates soil erosion to human civilizations. And that villain was the plow. It wasn't the axe, it was the plow that followed, that was responsible for the wholesale loss of soil across broad regions of terrain that I'll show you some examples of in a minute. But is that invention of the plow fundamentally altered the balance of soil production and soil erosion on the land that we depend on to grow our food, by dramatically increasing the pace of soil erosion such that it was outstripped the pace of soil building. And if you think about soil the same way we think about our bank accounts, we have income, that's the equivalent of making new soil. We have expenses, that's the equivalent of eroding the soil off, and we have our savings. And we all know that if we spend money faster than we make it for long enough, we burn through our savings. Civilizations, it turns out, have done the same thing with their soil. You think of it as the natural capital that allows us to feed our current and future generations. And if we are losing it faster than we're rebuilding or replacing it, we're literally running out of it. And I'm not arguing today that we're going to run out of soil and run out of dirt in the next couple of years. But what I am arguing is that the long-term trend of land degradation and a rising human population are working at odds with one another. And this has had unfortunate consequences for civilizations in the past that we would do well to learn from in the world today. So I'm going to spare you most of the examples, but I am going to start off with the example of classical Greece, because classical Greece is a good example of the role of tillage-based erosion or plow-based agriculture causing enough erosion to impact a broad landscape. Because when cycles of erosion and soil formation in ancient Greece really began in the Bronze Age, with a big erosional event right after the introduction of plow-based agriculture. So what happened is when farming practices came from Asia Minor over onto the Greek peninsula in the Bronze Age, the landscape looked a lot like this. This is a cross section, so you're looking at the side of a hillside as if you dug a big trench from the ridge top down to the valley bottom and looked at the side of the trench. These vertical lines here, that's meant to represent the soil. And there was an open oak woodland in the Greek landscape, sort of a broken oak forest. Think maybe the rolling hills of California as an analog. But there was about 1 to 3 feet of soil on the hillsides. And then when cultivation arrived, where do you think that the Greeks first started farming? Well, they started down in the valley bottoms, right? Because it was relatively flat, it was by streams, well-watered, easily worked terrain. And as their population grew, they started spreading agriculture up the hillsides such that by the end of the Bronze Age, they were farming literally up to virtually ridge tops. And what Tjeerd Van Andel and Chris Runnels studied back in the 1980s was how that led to the shedding of the soil off the hillsides and its accumulation down in the valley bottoms. Through that process of plowing, leaving the land vulnerable to erosion by water or by wind, and stripping the soil off the hillsides, dumping it down in the valley bottoms. And of course, that means there's less arable land. There's less land that you're able to farm if you've taken the hillsides out of production. And this is a problem that impacted the Greek landscape. What did it do to the population? Well, the thing that actually got me started writing the Dirt book was when Van Andel and Reynolds put out a paper back in the 1980s where they documented the differences in the population density of a particular region in southern Greece from 6000 BC, so literally the whole sweep of the post-agricultural world through to today over there on the right, And each of those little black dots is where they reconstructed the population density of this region. And you'll notice that there's two characteristics to this curve. One of them is trivial and the other is super cool. And it's the combination that led me to start thinking about and writing the Dirt Book. And of course, the trivial aspect, well, what you have here is you have a rise into the Bronze Age, a crash into a Dark Age, a second rise in population in the age of classical Greece, a crash into a Dark Age, and then a rise in population in the modern age. So you have a cycle of three civilizations occupying the same piece of land. There's very few places in the world where you can actually look to where the archaeology of three civilizations on the same piece of land has been done. So the trivial aspect of this curve is, why does the amplitude of each cycle get higher over time? And that's obviously because we have better technology today than we did in the Bronze Age, right? We've got John Deere tractors and fertilizers and things, and that you can grow more food per hectare than you could with just a digging stick and an oxen. But what intrigued me is, why the periodicity? Why a several thousand year run up, a crash for 1,000 years or two, a run up again, and another crash for about 1,000, 1,500 years? There seems to be, and what is the implication of what would happen to the right as you go forward in the future? And are there lessons that we might learn for global agriculture in this cycle of erosion, and then a collapse, and then a subsequent civilization rising and collapsing? Well, and I'm obviously going to be making the tie to soil erosion here, but we'll get to sort of the data that allows us to predict a time scale for actually an agricultural civilization to survive. But I want to make the point here that the problem of erosion is not just one of ancient history. This is a winter wheat field in eastern Washington. It's over from the Palouse region, and you'll notice there's no crop on the field at this time. It's an example of their traditional wheat fallow rotation. And the problem, of course, with a freshly plowed field is, if it rains, all these little channels can actually be carved into the landscape, and you can erase them with a single pass of the plow, right? You can just like knock them over, fill in the holes. But if that keeps happening year after year, it can really add up to large changes over time. This is another figure, another image of a winter wheat field from the Palouse. It's from the corner of a field right by the fence line that the farmer back in the 1911, built around their water cistern because they didn't want to plow over their water supply. And so the only thing that's happened for 50 years between 1911, when that fence was first installed, and 1961, when the photograph was taken by Vern Kaiser, is that this field was planted in winter wheat and fallow, and those little rills would develop. When it rained, you'd have erosion, and year after year that erosion added up to the point where a cliff developed at the edge of the field. Now, what I haven't told you is how high that cliff is. Notice this little black line over here. So from the bottom there to up there, that's a 1 foot increment on a survey rod that's kind of washed out on the negative. But this is a 5 foot cliff. You had 5 feet of erosion in 50 years. That's about a foot every decade, or about roughly an inch a year. There's nowhere on earth that soils form that fast, except my wife's garden, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But the nature doesn't form soils that fast. The world record rate of natural soil formation is about 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters a year. And I know that because one of my graduate students published it a few years ago from one of the South Island of New Zealand. It's literally falling apart as geology is like raising these mountains up into the air. Nature tends to build soils fairly slowly. The problem with conventional agriculture using tillage is that we can lose them even faster. And you hopefully are sitting there going, well, Dave, isn't that like example just like one corner of one field in Eastern Washington? How typical is that? Well, it's extreme. That's why I use it. It's a good teaching slide. It's the most extreme example I could find. So the question is, how typical is it? Well, consider the southeastern United States. This gray noodle that's up on the screen now extends from Virginia up here down to Alabama down in the lower left-hand corner, and that's the Piedmont or hill country. So we're not looking at the broad coastal plain of the Carolinas. We're not looking at the rocky spine of the Appalachians. This is the upland hill country that'd be kind of like the landscape of classical Greece when you think about sort of slopes and vegetation and so forth. Different species, obviously. But you'll notice that it's showing 4 to 10 inches of historical erosion across pretty much the whole region. And what do we mean by historical erosion? Erosion since the dawn of colonial agriculture. So post-European arrival erosion in this region, which is once one of the bread baskets of the early North American English colonies. Now, 4 to 10 inches of soil loss, how big a deal is that? Well, there was only about 6 to 12 inches of rich, fertile black topsoil in this region to begin with. So if it's been documented that we could basically shave off the whole topsoil across a region that was once one of the breadbaskets of our country and do it in just a couple hundred years, think what the Greeks could have done with their 1,000-year run at southern Greece, or the Romans could have done with a similar run at central Italy. It starts to put into perspective the idea that regional soil loss from regularized tilling could actually add up over time in ways that could compromise human societies. Now, this shows you 2 soils from within that gray noodle in North Carolina that also illustrate that the problem with land degradation is not just the loss of the soil from eroding it off, but it's also converting forest soil like the nice brown stuff over here on the left of the screen into this khaki stuff on the right side of the screen. These soils are essentially were excavated with, I excavated them with a shovel from different sides of a fence line. They're literally a few feet away from each other. But the one on the right has been farmed conventionally for 100 years using intensive tillage and a lot of nitrogen-based fertilizers, which tends to reduce soil organic matter. The soil on the left, that's from a forest that had been a farm up in the 19th century, but it was abandoned in the late 19th century. So it's about 100 to 150 years worth of regrowth vegetation, and it's just been left alone to restore itself. Notice the color difference. The one on the right looks like khaki California beach sand, and there's a good reason for that. This is beach sand, but it's 10-million-year-old beach sand. This is Miocene age beach sand. The parent material, the stuff the soil is made from, is identical on either side of the fence. The only difference is how people have treated this land for the last 100 years. And the difference in color, well, that's mostly a difference in organic matter. And what is organic matter? Well, it's 50% carbon. So you can start to make a case, as I'll do as we go through this, that farming practices or the way that we treat the land that can convert degraded soil back into soil like this is actually taking carbon from the atmosphere and putting it back in the land where it can actually do us some good in terms of driving soil fertility. So soil fertility and degradation is not just the loss of the soil, it's also from the loss of organic matter. And if you look at what's happened to our farmland soils across the US today, the soil organic matter content of many soils in North America is only about half of what they were when they were first converted from forests or prairies to farmland. In other words, we've done what was done on those North Carolina fields to an awful lot of agricultural fields around the United States by degrading the organic matter content of those soils by roughly half in a couple hundred years or less, depending on where you are in the country. So one of the things that I did after doing a lot of this research in terms of looking at the state of agricultural land in past societies is to ask today, what's the rate at which farms are eroding around the world? So I basically went to the library for about 3 weeks and vacuumed up data out of I think it was about 1,400 different studies that I compiled to look at the question of how fast are conventional farms eroding around the world today. And the number I came up with was about 1.5 millimeters a year as an average. Now that's a slow rate, right? Your fingernails grow faster than that. But if you think about it in terms of the life scale of the land, that's actually a really fast rate. It means you could lose an inch of topsoil in 20 years. How long does it take nature to replace that inch of topsoil? Well, I also compiled rates of soil formation from around the world, and the global average I came up with was about 0.02 millimeters a year, 2% of a millimeter per year. That means it takes roughly 1,000 years to replace that inch of soil that can be lost in 20 years of conventional farming. That is the problem, is that we have an imbalance with a net global loss of soil from agricultural fields, on the order of, I'll be conservative, order of 1 millimeter a year. What does that mean? It means I've basically given you the data that it would take to do a very rough kind of back of the envelope calculation for how long you think an agricultural civilization ought to last. And if we have a net loss of about 1 millimeter a year of topsoil off of farmed fields, that implies that it would take only 500 to 1,000 years to erode off a 0.5 meter to 1 meter thick hill slope soil. That's about the average hill slope soil thickness under native conditions around the world. And it turns out that 1,000 years, plus or minus, is approximately the lifespan of most major civilizations outside of the world's major river floodplains. So I'm hoping that you're thinking of, oh, what about the Tigris and Euphrates in the Fertile Crescent? What about the Nile River in Egypt, the big rivers of lowland China, the Indus and the Brahmaputra in India? These are all places where people have farmed for millennia. Well, they also share a physical geography. They're big river floodplains. And what happens on a floodplain? Well, it floods. And what do floods bring? Well, a lot of water, obviously, but they also bring silt, sand, clay, mud. And how thick is a single grain of sand? Well, a millimeter or two. Remember that global average erosion rate from tillage-based agriculture? It's about the same pace. In other words, if you had an environment like a river floodplain, where under natural conditions, even a single grain of sand was deposited on average each year, it could completely keep up with the pace of topsoil loss under conventional farming. This is why civilizations in those areas have been able to thrive for millennia. Whereas if you look at areas like Greece and Rome, where farming gets up out of the valley bottoms and into the hills, the clock starts ticking with about a 1,000-year run at things. Now, that concludes the depressing part of the talk, okay? We're going to shift into the more optimistic part, because I started asking myself the question in finishing the dirt book up of, is soil restoration possible? Could we actually reverse the pattern of historical declines? And I started gaining insight into that. Literally, as I was finishing writing dirt, my wife and I bought a house in North Seattle, and she's a gardener. And we ended up writing about our experience of her restoring fertility to our yard and rebuilding our soil right under my nose at the same time that I was writing about the destruction of soils in past civilizations. She was basically restoring fertility to our yard in a way that was very profound and set me off onto writing Growing a Revolution afterwards. But what did we have? Well, we bought a house that had a side yard that we thought was a great sort of blank slate for building the garden that my biologist wife had always wanted to have. And I was like, great, this will be great. We shaved off the old growth Seattle lawn that was on that. And we realized that we should have dug a soil pit before we bought the house, because this is not the rich, fertile black earth that you would sort of hope to have as a gardener. This was glacial till and sand and a little fill from when they excavated the basement. There wasn't a single damn worm underneath that lawn when we pulled it off. There was no visible life in the soil, probably a few microbes. But we realized that, okay, if we want to have this garden, we need to do a little rehabilitation work on the soil. And I should say that this was essentially mostly Ann's efforts, because you can see there that we had the mineral matter for soil. My job was done as a geologist. We had the rocks, we had crushed rocks. A glacier had delivered them and crushed them up. What we didn't have was the life. We didn't have the biology. So Ann took it on herself to actually start, asking arborists for all the wood chips they could get. We got, loads of zoo doo from the Seattle Zoo, the composted herbivore manure that is so rich from there. Coffee grounds, our own kitchen scraps. She composted and mulched for a number of years, and we started to notice that the soil was changing. It was going from that khaki color that it started with, this khaki color, and it's ended up today this dark black color in just about 10 years of composting and mulching and gardening. We had about 1% organic matter when we started. We're up to about almost 10% across much of the yard today. That translates into literally tons of carbon parked in the yard, and the plants are thriving. And we started to notice the changes after just a couple years of this intensive composting and mulching activity. And then we gauged it as we went. In hindsight, I wished that we had actually, studied it and put in like baselines and measured stuff and all that. But no, this was just our home garden. We were not thinking of trying to make a point. But as we saw the soil change, we started to look into, well, what was happening? Why was this happening? And we were composting and mulching, but the soil food web was doing most of the work. The critters in the soil, the bacteria and fungi, were breaking down the organic matter in the compost and returning it to forms that the plants could then take back up, and that became soil organic matter. The microarthropods and the nematodes and protozoa that were grazing on the bacteria and fungi that were eating the compost that we were layering on the soil, what do they do when they consume these other critters? Well, they excrete their remains, and they're really rich in nitrogen and phosphorus and mineral elements, the things that were in the plants that were shedding the leaves to begin with and that got cycled through the life in the soil ended up being made back available to the plants. And as we looked into this, we basically kept running into this term labeled down here on the red arrow of exudates. because looking into the world of soil life led us to the world of the rhizosphere, and that's literally Greek for the zone around the roots of a plant. So rhizome and sphere, zone around the roots of a plant. And that's one of the most life-rich areas on the planet, as I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But we also learned that, we know that plants take in carbon dioxide and merge it with water to build through photosynthesis, to build their carbon-rich bodies. And that roots serve as straws, in effect, to take that material up from the soil, the water and mineral nutrients that are in the soil. But as we looked into what was happening, the relationship between roots and the rhizosphere, we kept running into the idea that plants are actively exuding into the soil somewhere around up to a third to even more of the carbon that they pull in through photosynthesis, they'll push out through their roots as exudates. What are those exudates? Well, they're things like carbohydrates, they're things like proteins, they're things like lipids, like fats. What does that sound like? Carbs, proteins, and fats. It's food. Plants are actually pushing food out of their roots into the soil, and they're doing it to recruit microbes that live around the soil. And if they were doing it to recruit microbes that live around the soil that were pathogens, that would have been shut down a long time ago evolutionarily. They're doing it because they actually get a benefit out of it. Because as we looked into this sort of new science of soil ecology that has been really opened up by the development of gene sequencing technologies that allow people to study the interactions of bacteria and fungi in the soil. If you think about how do you study the ecology of bacteria, they're all like these little, little single cell organisms that look, that don't have a whole lot of visible variability between them. Genetically, they're really different. They all have different biochemical tricks up their sleeve. So what we found was that in the rhizosphere, plants are pushing exudates out of their roots into the rhizosphere, shown as this purple halo around roots and root hairs. And that rhizosphere extends out about 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter, the sort of thickness to the length of your thumbnail, from each and every root. These exudates don't make it out of the rhizosphere. They get consumed by something. And in fact, plants will tailor their exudates they push out to recruit particular microbes, particular bacteria and fungi that then metabolize those exudates and turn them into things that the plants can take back up because they're like right around their roots. When we found studies that documented that bacteria in the rhizosphere were taking plant exudates, metabolizing them, and then excreting as their waste product plant growth promoting hormones that the plant then would take back up and grow bigger so it could capture more solar energy and put more exudates out and to feed more microbes, we recognize, oh, that's a positive feedback, right? The healthier the plants, the more microbes you can feed. And if the microbes are making things that make the plants grow big and healthy, it's a virtuous circle. Fungi in the soil will actually go out and mine specific elements like phosphorus out of mineral particles and exchange them to plants for a cut of the exudates. So a biological bazaar is happening within soils wherein the plants are helping to support communities of life in the soil that in turn promote the growth and health and defense of the plants. And we go into a lot more about that in the parallels of what goes on in the human gut in the hidden half of nature. But you can go down the list of parallels from nutrient acquisition to immune system and defense teeing up and preparing and bolstering. You just go right down the list, and the parallels are pretty astounding. So that led me to, it's one thing to be able to restore fertility rapidly, far faster than nature did, right? Remember, Anne had built, 6-8 inches of fertile soil in a decade when it would take nature centuries to do that. What did we have going for us? Intensive compost and mulching and all the sources of organic matter that we had. So it's one thing to restore fertility to your lot in urban Seattle. It's a whole nother thing to ask, well, could we do this on farms? So I took about 6 months of my research agenda and dedicated it to traveling around the world, examining farms where farmers had taken khaki soil like this one on the left and turned it into this darker, richer, more organic matter rich, more fertile soil on the right, and asked them, what did they do? How did they do it? And to search for the commonalities between farmers. And I went to equatorial West Africa, Central America, and farms across North America. And what I basically came up with is that there were 3 common principles that all the farms that I visited that had been very successful at doing what Anne had done to our yard to their farms. had practiced minimal or no disturbance farming. So they were no-till farmers. They weren't plowing, and there's specialized equipment you can use to do no-till, but it's a whole different way of doing things. They maintained a permanent ground cover, so no fields looked like those fields from the Palouse that I showed you. Everything always was planted in something. If not a crop, it would be a cover crop in between the crops. So always keeping living roots in the ground to produce those exudates, feed the microbes. And these farmers also practiced diverse crop rotations. They didn't just grow one or two things. They were growing 4, 5, 6, 7 crops in a rotation. And why are all three of these principles important? Because this is a recipe for cultivating the beneficial life in the soil, all those little microbes that are up on the screen. What would you do if you just thought about how would I support the beneficial life in the soil? Well, you wouldn't disturb them, you'd feed them, and you'd give them a community to interact with. Think about how dysfunctional an entire city made of geologists would be. We'd have great arguments about the history of the place while we all starved. So those general principles translate to different settings. That was one of the big findings I had from doing this global effort. But I found that the specific practices need to be tailored to the specific setting. What the farmers were doing in Ghana was really different than what they were doing in Costa Rica or the Dakotas or Ohio. So the principles translate, but the specific practices don't. And therein lies both the opportunity and the challenge of a more regenerative style of agriculture based on adopting these three principles of no-till cover crops and a diversity of rotations. I'll show you examples of just a couple farmers before we end here. This gentleman here is Dwayne Beck. He runs Dakota Lakes Research Farm in South Dakota. What he has done is he has taken farmers that he works with through the process of adopting no-till farming, then adopting cover crops, then making more complex rotations. You can see how what they have is the remnants of the last crop in the rows in between the next crop here, and the remains of a cover crop that's going to be overtaken by the current cash crop that's coming in. What this did is actually revolutionized agriculture in this part of South Dakota. Why? Because it reduced their use of diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide by more than half. Restoring health to their soil allowed their crops to thrive in ways that didn't require as many chemical inputs. And what are the big expenses on a modern farm in the US? Well, diesel, fertilizer, and pesticides top the list. If you could reduce your expenses by half or more and keep your yields up so your income was the same, the difference translates into a better profitability. So what happened to their crop yields? Well, you can compare for yourself over here on the left. Their soybean yields went up, their corn yields went up as well, about 10, 20% for each of them. The point being is that it's not adopting this new suite of processes, practices, is not something where you're framing it as, is it more economical for the farmers or better for the environment? The answer is it's both. It's a win-win. And so when I left, Dwayne was working with farms that got up to 20,000 acres. These are like horizon to horizon farms in the Dakotas. When I left there, I went to Equatorial West Africa and interviewed farmers who were at the opposite end of the spectrum, who were dealing with small scale farms, small scale subsistence farms. And this gentleman here, Kofi Boa, runs the Center for No-Till Research in Kumasi, Ghana. And I call your attention to his hat. Notice what it says: got dirt, get soil. Okay, he gets it, right? I knew when I got out of the van that I was gonna like this guy, and I loved what he had done to the land of the farmers that he was working with. What he had done is he'd trained farmers in his native village to transition from their slash and burn style of agriculture to a new style where they were doing no-till with cover crops. So they stopped plowing. They were planting. These are small farms, so they're all planting and plowing by hand, essentially. But they would then have cover crops, and they got their diversity in by planting 6 to 8 crops in the field at the same time. So they were doing polycultures. They were not just growing one crop in a field, they were growing a diversity of crops, and everything was a cash crop. And where they couldn't do cash crops, they would keep the ground covered with cover crops. What did it do? It cut down their erosion rate by a factor of 20. They were actually hemorrhaging topsoil off the region in their traditional practices. When they went to no-till, they cut erosion down so they weren't losing the soil anymore at anywhere near that pace. But notice what happened to their crop yields. Their corn yield tripled and their cowpea yield doubled. And they did it without adding additional inputs. In fact, They were doing it without, with very little pesticides. They would use a little bit of herbicide on occasion. They don't really have money for fertilizer. There's a good reason why the Green Revolution did not help many subsistence farmers in Africa, and that's because they don't have money to buy fertilizer. They don't have money to buy patented seeds. They don't have the capital to actually buy into that whole new style of farming. What Kofi taught them was a style of farming that changed how they thought about their soil and the practices that they used, and resulted in huge increases in yield that were transformative for the economy of his village. The next guy I'll tell you about is David Brandt. He runs Brandt Family Farm near Carroll, Ohio. He's modeling his tillage radishes here for you. And he's a farmer who he grows wheat, corn, and soybeans for the North American commodity crop markets, but that's not all he grows. He gets diversity into his fields through planting 10, 12 species cover crop mixes, like the field that he's standing in there. And so he's basically sort of tweaking that same spirit of practices, or he's using those same principles, but tweaking the practices to fit the economy he lives within. And so what he's doing is he's doing something very different than his conventional neighbors. The year that I visited him, the county average of his conventional neighbors were to, be doing full tillage, using 200 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer an acre, 2.5 quarts of Roundup or glyphosate. That cost $500 an acre for the typical county operation. And the typical yield that year was about 100 bushels of corn per acre. Now you can do the math yourself, but at $4 a bushel, that means they were losing $100 an acre on their corn. And there's a peer-reviewed study study published on crop yields in Iowa, the neighboring state, the same year, that found that 24% of all farmers there lost more than $100 an acre on their corn. There's something seriously wrong with an agricultural system where hardworking people on really good soils are losing money the more they plant. Fortunately, David Brandt had a very different story right across the road. He's basically been doing no-till for 44 years, ever since he came back from a stint in the Marine Corps and in Vietnam in the 1960s. He came back and all he had was access to no-till equipment. So he started doing that. He loved what it did to his soil. So he started planting cover crops. He then went into the kind of diversity that you see in the field that he's standing in. He's not doing any tillage now. So he's using half the diesel. He's only driving his tractor across the fields half as much as his neighbors. He's using 1/8 of the nitrogen fertilizer. He's not an organic farmer. He'd probably hit you if you called him an organic farmer. But I started teasing him that he was an organic-ish farmer because he was using so little in the way of chemical inputs. And his response is like, yeah, I don't want to pay for them. If I don't need them, I'm not going to buy them. He was using 1 quart of Roundup per acre. His total costs are $320 an acre. He was wildly out yielding his neighbors, growing a lot more corn. And at $4 a bushel, he was making $400 an acre. He was very profitable right next door in the same years that his farmers were losing their shirt. So these kinds of practices can work out well for farmers. Why do they work well? This shows you the difference in the soil between David Brandt's farm and his neighbor's farm. The soil here, the khaki one, the one that looks like that North Carolina tobacco plantation or my wife's garden before she started restoring the soil, that's what the kind of soil David started with in the 1970s and what his neighbors still have. It's got hardly any organic matter in it. There's hardly any soil life in it. David Brandt's soil is over there on the left in a photo taken the year before I visited and interviewed him. It's up to more than 6 or 8% organic matter. It's basically, he's built the organic matter back up to what the native soil in the region had when it was a forest. He's basically restored life to his land, and that's allowed him to greatly reduce his use of agrochemicals. The last farmer I'll share you with is this gentleman here, Gabe Brown, who's standing in front of his cattle. He's been using them to restore fertility to not just his crop fields, but also to a broad swath of native prairie that he's been using cattle to restore. He uses a different style of grazing called intensive rotational grazing. I won't go into that in this talk. Happy to take questions on that afterwards if you'd like. But what I want to emphasize here is that how Gabe is using cattle, his livestock, to come in and graze off his cover crops from his market garden, where he grows vegetables to sell at the farmer's market. And he brings the chickens in to graze, to eat the bugs that live in the cow patties that the cows are leaving on this field. And what Gabe's basically done is he's basically got himself completely off of fertilizers and completely off of pesticides by instead using the cycling of nutrients in this manner. And so he's basically using his cows to turn his cover crops into manure, which is fertilizer, to grow his next cash crop. And he likes to say that he's no longer writing checks for fertilizers and pesticides. Instead, he's selling beef, chickens, and eggs. It's a better economic model. What did it do to his soil? The soil that he's holding up there in his right hand, that is the soil on that field that I just showed you. Doug, minutes from taking that photograph, he's built it back up to this incredibly rich, fertile black earth. His neighbor's soil is over there shown in his other hand. It's not bad soil, but it's nowhere near as good as what Gabe's been able to do in restoring fertility to his land. What did he do? This shows you a timeline of how he's essentially restored his soil, going from 1993, when he started off in no-till, he had less than 2% organic matter. By 2010, after he started to diversify his cash crops, add cover crops, go to multi-species cover crops, he basically raised the organic matter level on his ranch to about 6%. He tripled it in less than 20 years. That one field that I showed you, he got up to about 11% organic matter, but that's where he did extra stuff there, kind of like what Ann did in bringing in nutrients to our fields. But this tripling of soil organic matter on a fully economical operational farm that has thousands of acres is actually the inspirational part of where we think, imagine if we could do that to farmland around the world, how much carbon we could put back into the ground. So the recipe that Ann and I came up with in Growing a Revolution to describe these practices, the catchphrase is ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. And you could put a little asterisk on it if you want, of maybe add cows if you want to basically accelerate the process of rebuilding soil fertility. Adding livestock back into this more of a conservation agricultural style of doing things could actually accelerate the restoration process. And you don't have to just take my word for it that this works and is more profitable for farmers. Claire LeCon and Jonathan Lundgren put out a paper the year after Growing a Revolution came out. They basically published this study that looked at the total revenue for conventional and regenerative farms in the American Midwest. They took about 20 paired conventional and regenerative farms, so plow-based farms and farms more like the ones I've just been showing you. And they looked at their corn crops and notice that the revenue that they get, the height of the bars, is higher for the regenerative fields. So the yields were higher in the regenerative fields, just like David Brandt's example, but their expenses are shown here in the colors. So you can shave those colors off the top of the bar, and that leaves you with the white bit that's labeled profit. Notice that the regenerative farms were more profitable than their conventional ones. Why? Because they weren't spending all that money on chemicals. It actually worked out better for the farmers economically. And this is what started to turn me into an optimist on this issue, is if there's ways to re-engage the biological elements of soil fertility that allow farmers to spend less to grow as much or more, it will be more profitable for the world's farmers. And there's a connection to pesticides and pests as well, because Jonathan Lundgren is an entomologist. He loves to study insects. So one of the things that Claire and Jonathan did in their study is they measured the corn pests on both regenerative and conventional farms that were growing corn in that year. And you'll notice that the regenerative fields had about 1/10 of the pests that eat corn as you found on the conventional fields. Now, which of these fields were the ones using pesticides? The ones that had all the pests. They don't put that on the label that basically says that the more of these products you use, the more pests you'll have. But so what's the deal? Well, if you plant corn year after year in the same fields, you're basically setting up a grocery store for pests. If you have a diverse rotation, you can break the pest carryover cycle, but the pests also adapt to these conditions. But the real big difference is that pesticides don't just kill the pests, they also kill the insect predators of the pests. And if you remember back from your, if you had a college biology or ecology class, and you remember those predator-prey curves, think about the wolves and the deer. Once the wolves eat all the deer, the wolves don't come back until the deer come back. The prey have to come back first. And so if you kill off all the predators at the same time that you kill off all the pests, what comes back first? The pests, every time. And we've basically solidified a system of farming that guarantees that farmers will be hooked on needing intensive amounts of fertilizer and pesticides because they've degraded their soil. But it's reversible. That's what Ann demonstrated in her yard. That's what David Brandt and Kofi demonstrated on their farms. So what are the benefits of healthy soil? Higher farmer profits, I put at the top of the list because that's going to be the means for actually accelerating adoption. You can grow comparable yields, which means we're not trading off, feeding the world versus improving the environment. These are complementary because it uses less fertilizer, less pesticide, less fossil fuels to grow comparable yields. And it also has a side benefit of increasing the amount of carbon that's stored in the soil. It also helps with water pollution and with water retention, which can help with resilience in the face of climate change. In other words, there's lots of things that are aligning towards this new style of agriculture, portending, shall we say, what I like to call the fifth agricultural revolution, one based on the principles of rebuilding soil health. And that's what I've been writing about extensively for the last 10 years and looking at this stuff, because it seems like we're at a point in human history where the economic and environmental and social stars are aligning to accelerate this transition to a new style of agriculture that is founded on building soil health and that will allow us to greatly reduce our agrochemical use and still maintain our ability to feed the world by taking land that has been degraded and returning it to a much more verdant state. You could talk about how much carbon we could put in the ground globally, how much land we could restore globally. There's lots of arguments over that, but the basic idea holds water. And that's basically what I was getting into in looking at these three books. Ann and I are now trying to finish a book looking at how these regenerative farming practices translate into better nutritional quality of food for people. And with luck, we will get that finished up and out by the end of, well, hopefully we're going to finish it soon. That's what I've had my head buried in all summer. And, things always take longer than you think they will. But I should probably stop there and be happy to engage with questions if you all have them.
Okay.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. We have time for one question and then we will wrap up. So I have a question from Eric Christensen.
Yes.
Do you have an estimate for how much carbon could be sequestered in the soil if this kind of agriculture was adopted on a broad scale?
Yeah, in Growing a Revolution, I tried to parse that because you'll find that there's widely variable estimates of that because people assume different things. But if you basically assume that we could do this to all the world's farmland, I think you can get a serious down payment on reducing current emissions. And the numbers I came up with was somewhere between about 1.25 of current emissions for a number of decades, for the balance of this century. It's not going to reverse what we've already done. And it's not going to save us if we don't stop further fossil fuel emissions, but it can serve as one of these wedges that can actually help us by greatly reducing the other things we will need to do to actually hit the right target. Now, that estimate could be a little on the high side. There are those who make lower estimates, and you'll also find some activists who basically will predict that we could completely offset fossil fuel emissions. And I'm just not sure that is, I don't think it's that high a potential, but I think it's well worth doing even if we can only get 1/4 to 1/2. It's a damn good down payment. Pardon?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sure,
This has
no
been
worries.
such an informative discussion, and I'd like to turn it over to Catherine. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Well, you've all just experienced a key component of virtually every Rotary meeting. As lifelong learners, Rotarians love to learn new things, and we have great programs. And David, you certainly delivered. So thank you so much.
No worries.
So what's next? Well, follow up with our speaker. Perhaps read his book. We often do that in Rotary. We engage with our guest speakers. So David, hopefully you'll hear from some of us who've been on the meeting today. But what else? I'd like you to consider this very special opportunity to engage with the new Environmental Rotary Club of Puget Sound. First of all, like our Facebook page. Just search for Environmental Rotary Club of Puget Sound, and follow activities and updates on Facebook. I'd like to invite you to come as a guest to the next meeting of the club on November 17th. Come and meet other charter members and prospective members. We'd very much welcome your ideas on future projects, future speakers, future field trips, different things that this club can do that are of interest to you. Please go to our district, Rotary District website, www.rotarydistrict5030.org. You'll see some information broadly about what's happening with Rotary in this region, but there'll be an opportunity to click on a form, provide some contact information, and then you'll regularly get onto our distribution list for information. And above all, I'd like you to consider this an invitation to join, to become a member of the Environmental Rotary Club of Puget Sound as an individual or as a corporate member. And there'll be more information about how those membership categories and other details of membership, what's involved, coming up at that next meeting on November 17th. So thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you, David. And we look forward to growing this new cause-based club in our region in support of our climate and our environment. Good night.
All right. So that ends our formal program. And if anyone would like to stay and have a more social chat, you are most welcome to unmute yourselves and we can just speak freely.
You will notice.
Also, I noticed that David is busy answering most of the questions in the chat.
Thank you for that.
Sure, no, trying to do that, and happy to engage in other questions too.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, this was so informative. Thank you very much. I actually had a question. I know that around areas that have desert already, that there's a problem with the desert growing bigger.
Yeah, desertification. Yeah.
And so what are these communities that surround deserts doing to undo the desertification?
Boy, well, the short answer is not enough. But there's some really interesting examples. One of the things I wrote about in Dirt is that if you think back to the Sahel in the early 70s, so when desertification first became sort of an issue that many of us were aware of, there's this little patch of land that stayed as a green diamond in the middle of the desertifying area. And it turned out that the reason it stayed green is that there was a barbed wire fence around it. So it was, what happened in the Sahel is that the traditional grazing practices got disrupted when, after the Second World War, when national boundaries really became real things in that part of Africa. It disrupted a pattern where nomadic pastoralists had taken their cows seasonally north and then back south, following the progression of grass through the region. And the cows would end up fertilizing the fields of the farmers in the south and then grazing to the north and then coming back down south. Once the borders were solidified, the cows stayed where they were all the time. And that was a recipe for degrading the land. And so one of the things that's very exciting is that sort of style of intensive rotational grazing that I was talking about briefly when I introduced Gabe Brown in the fourth farmer I talked about. That is actually able to, it's a style of grazing that can take very degraded land and bring it back to greater productivity. And I haven't visited examples in the Sonoran Desert, but I've seen presentations on how it's worked in the Sonoran Desert and been really impressed with what I saw. Now, I generally like to go places and see for myself, but it seems like there is there's some evidence that it can work in some places that are pretty damaged. It worked on Gabe Brown's farm in the Dakotas, but the land wasn't that damaged there. He's taken it from degraded to really good. But the Sonoran Desert stuff, it's land that's been destroyed, really desertified, that seems to be coming back to life. And there's a great book by Judith Schwartz. If you're really interested in the water end of things, Judith Schwartz has a new book called, I think it's Water in Plain Sight, that the paperback came out this year. That I read and was just like, yeah, she's on to that story, and she tells the story of the Sonoran Desert. So there's things people can do to help reverse desertification, but frankly, there hasn't been a lot of support at a policy level or through most of the major global charities that are focused on agriculture. An awful lot of them still tend to be focused on the totally misguided Green Revolution 2 for Africa. There's a lot of misconceptions out there in that world.
And there was a question that I found quite interesting. Let me find it here. So what is your opinion of the New Deal programs aimed at stemming soil erosion? Do you think those are effective, or are there ways that they could become more effective?
So do we mean the New Deal from the 30s or the Green New Deal?
Eric, do you want to clarify?
Yeah, it's a New Deal from the 30s that was aimed at trying to stem the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, okay, they
Surface and all.
Yeah, they were quite effective in certain areas. And if you made me put numbers on it, I would say that they reduced the national rate of soil loss by a factor of 2 to 4 or 5, but we're still a factor of 2 to 4 above any kind of a background rate. So they were very effective and useful in the right direction, but they weren't the whole answer. I have seen studies where if you adopt all 3 of those principles, you can basically turn it around so you're building soil fertility. And over the long run, we have to have some erosion, because otherwise we'll use up all the minerals that are in the rocks that are right at the surface, and we'll end up with horribly depleted soils. So you don't want to totally shut erosion off, but you want to slow it down enough so that soil building keeps pace.
Excellent. Very good. Well, does anyone else have a question that has not been addressed?
Oh, one just came in on the use of sewage, biosolids. And that's a really interesting question. There's a chapter in Growing Revolution where I try and wrestle with that. And it's a very interesting question that, relates to, there's a couple dimensions to it. The first is, like what's actually in the feedstock, because if you've got heavy metals in it, you're not getting those out through composting and mulching. So if you're going to do biosolids, you have to be really clear and careful on what's going into it. And there's also questions and problems with over applying it, like putting 3 feet on a forest around here or something. Those kind of issues are bad ones as well. But there's been a number of studies of it that look at if it's well made, well sourced, well made, and judiciously applied, it can actually be very, very effective and very safe.
Could you define well made? Because we are a group of people that has been working with sewage for 22 years, and we follow, let's say if you take the example of a lot of European countries that are starting now to completely abandon the use of any kind of sewage or whatever one calls it on land applied, because the original idea is obviously household produce it, that's fine, but usually you have industry, you have runoff waters from streets, roads, whatever you have it. You have so many different components from hospitals, whatever you have it, right?
Right. What I've seen are studies that look at how you can basically, most of the pharmaceuticals and antibiotics, if you compost stuff and you let it basically go through the full fungal evolution of a year-long composting, you can get rid of most of the pharmaceuticals and antibiotics. You cannot get rid of the heavy metals.
Exactly.
And so
or dioxins, furans, whatever you have it, all that stuff, really high levels. Yeah.
So you've got to be very careful in terms of what you're allowing to go into it. I know when the city of Tacoma got into making their sewage treatment plant into something that produces Tagro, the first thing they did is they basically tried to make sure that they limited the how much in the way of heavy metals were getting into their sewage stream.
Right, and that's almost impossible to register, I mean, regulate, you know?
Especially at Tacoma.
And a lot of, you know, if you consider a lot of the things that we are familiar to us, very familiar with is leachate from landfills. And on the subtitle deregulations from the US Department of Wastewater Management, if you pipe in, they see the highly toxic stuff from landfills, but before it hits a sewage treatment, so-called treatment facility, and you pipe in regular normal sewage from households, it all of a sudden declassifies it as non-toxic, right?
Oh,
And that
so-
stuff then in King County, for example, is used in King County Forest in Eastern Washington, all applied all over agriculture and used, and that's for us a big no-no.
Yeah. So it's, you know, it all depends on where you're getting it and how it's made. And there's, you know, the idea of using raw sewage or stuff that hasn't been, and that's more for cattle manure. I mean, anything like that should be thoroughly composted and carefully sourced,
Right. Well,
and
thank
not
you
over
so-
applied.
Yes. Thank you so much, David, for this insightful and informative talk. And thank all of you for coming and staying after the formal program ended. And we hope to see you on November 17th. Thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful weekend.
Great job, Kimberly.
care.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, David.